In December 1993, a 111-year-old British engineering giant quietly went into receivership. 42 years earlier, in February 1951, this same company delivered the Ferranti Mark I to the University of Manchester. It was the world's first commercially available general-purpose computer. Long before IBM dominated the corporate office, a British firm had already manufactured and sold the future. When the company finally collapsed, the consequences echoed far beyond empty factories. British engineers lost a pioneer. The nation that had helped crack the Enigma code lost the corporation that built its post-war computing foundation. A vast legacy of industrial research was simply carved up and sold. The paradox is that Ferranti did not disappear because it failed to invent the digital age. It disappeared because it proved that building the best machine was no longer enough without an American-scale sales machine to protect it. But the real story of Ferranti is not only the story of a bankrupt engineering firm, it is the story of how Britain built the first commercial computer, defined the architecture of the future, and then lost the market that followed. Every week, we tell the stories of British machines, engineering empires, and software houses that once taught the country what the future felt like, and what happened when the global market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with a bankruptcy, but with a specific place inside a university laboratory in Manchester in the late 1940s. To understand how Britain lost its computing supremacy, one must first look at what the country possessed before a market even existed. In the late 1940s, computing was not a commercial industry. It was a closely guarded military secret or an abstract mathematical theory. Post-war Britain was still rationing food and rebuilding its bombed cities. The concept of a computer, a programmable electronic machine that could execute different tasks without being physically rewired, did not exist in any public or commercial space. If a British company needed complex calculations for aeronautics or engineering, they relied on human clerks, mechanical calculators, or enormous analog computers that simulated physical problems. The future was waiting, but it was confined to university laboratories. That changed in Manchester. In June 1948, researchers at the University of Manchester successfully ran a program on a prototype called the Small-Scale Experimental Machine, widely known as the Manchester Baby. It was the first computer in the world to store its instructions electronically in its own memory. For the first time, a machine did not need its cables physically repatched to change a task. But a university laboratory is not a factory. The baby was a sprawling mass of metal racks, exposed wires, and glass tubes. It was built to prove a scientific principle, not to be sold. If Britain was going to maintain the technological edge it had forged during the Second World War, it needed to turn this fragile laboratory experiment into a reliable manufactured product. The British government, through the Ministry of Supply, understood this. They approached Ferranti. At the time, Ferranti was not a computer company. Based in Hollandwood, a suburb of Oldham in Greater Manchester, it was a heavy electrical engineering firm founded in the 19th century. They built massive transformers for the national grid, radar systems for the Ministry of Defense, and domestic radios. They understood how to manufacture complex electronics at scale. In the autumn of 1948, the government handed Ferranti a contract. Take the university's design and build a commercial machine. The result was the Ferranti Mark I. Delivered in February 1951, the Ferranti Mark I became the world's first commercially available general-purpose computer. It arrived at the University of Manchester a full month before the United States Census Bureau received its UNIVAC WE, giving Britain absolute primacy in the commercial timeline of the digital age. But the word computer in 1951 meant something entirely different from what it means today. The Ferranti Mark I did not sit on a desk. It occupied an entire purpose-built room. It consisted of 2 bays of equipment, each 16 feet long, consuming 25 kilowatts of electrical power. It was driven by thermionic valves, fragile heat-producing glass bulbs that acted as the machine's electronic switches, turning electrical currents on and off to perform logical operations. The Mark I used over 4,000 of them. Because valves frequently burned out under stress, the machine required a permanent staff of engineers to maintain it, replacing shattered glass tubes just to keep the system running. Data and instructions were not typed onto a screen. They were fed into the machine using paper tape. long, continuous strips of paper, punched with patterns of holes that a mechanical reader translated into digital data. To write software in 1951 meant sitting with a teleprinter, manually punching holes into a ribbon of paper, and feeding it into an optical reader that processed characters at a fraction of modern speeds. The machine's memory, the fast temporary storage it used while calculations were running, was built from Williams Kilburn tubes. These were modified cathode ray tubes, similar to early television screens, that stored digital bits as glowing dots of static electricity on the glass face of the tube. The operator could literally look at the screen and watch the memory of the computer glow in real time. This was not a machine for the high street. In an era when a decent British family home cost around £2,000, a Ferranti Mark I cost nearly £100,000. The user base was entirely composed of the scientific and military elite. The Ministry of Defense bought one to calculate weapons trajectories. Royal Dutch Shell used one in Amsterdam for industrial research. The machine was so historically unprecedented that the first programming manual for the Ferranti Mark I was written by Alan Turing, who was then working at the University of Manchester. In this early ecosystem, the market dynamics were unrecognizable. There were no computer magazines, no retail shelves, and no competing platforms. Ferranti ultimately built 9 of these machines, including the upgraded Mark I Star. Today, 9 sales would be a disastrous production run. In the early 1950s, 9 machines constituted an entire national computing industry. Ferranti had successfully bridged the gap between academic brilliance and industrial manufacturing. They had proven that a British company could engineer and sell the most advanced electronic architecture on Earth. The machine worked, and the history books were secured. But Ferranti was about to learn that building the first computer was entirely different from building a computer industry. The Ferranti Mark I had successfully proven that a computer could be manufactured and sold. But it also proved that the commercial market had a severe limitation. Early valve-based computers were notoriously fragile. A machine containing thousands of thermionic valves generated immense heat, and those glass bulbs routinely burned out. For a university laboratory or a military base, halting calculations to hunt for a shattered valve was an acceptable reality of experimental science. For a British commercial business trying to process a weekly payroll, a machine that broke down every few hours was entirely useless. If computing was going to expand beyond the Ministry of Defense and academic research, it had to survive the demands of the corporate office, it had to be reliable, it had to be understandable, and crucially, it had to be easy to fix. In 1956, Ferranti solved this problem. They released the Ferranti Pegasus. The Pegasus was a masterpiece of pragmatic British engineering, designed not just for sheer mathematical speed, but for continuous, uninterrupted business operations. It was the machine that truly pulled British computing out of the laboratory and placed it onto the high street and into the corporate headquarters. The breakthrough of the Pegasus was physical. Instead of wiring thousands of valves directly into massive, sprawling racks, Ferranti's engineers adopted a modular approach. They built the computer using standard plug-in packages, small, interchangeable plastic and metal units, each containing a specific circuit of valves and components. This completely changed the relationship between the machine and the people who maintained it. If a valve failed in the middle of a complex calculation, an engineer no longer had to painstakingly trace wires with a soldering iron. They simply pulled out the faulty package and pushed a fresh one into the slot. A repair that once took hours now took seconds. The processor, the main electronic system that performs calculations and executes instructions, was suddenly reliable enough to dictate the pace of an entire British office. This reliability opened the door to a completely new type of customer. The Pegasus was not just bought by scientists. It was bought by Hawker Aircraft to design jet fighters. It was bought by Bruce Peebles, a Scottish engineering firm, to calculate transformer designs. It was bought by the Admiralty to streamline naval logistics. It was even adopted by Midland Bank, becoming one of the first computers to handle everyday British financial data. To support these new corporate users, Ferranti established a dedicated computing center at 21 Portland Place in London. Because a Pegasus still cost around £50,000, an astronomical sum for most mid-sized businesses in the 1950s, Ferranti allowed companies to rent time on the machine by the hour. A British business could now send its clerks to London, carrying their data to buy a slice of the digital future. The ritual of using a computer in this era was intensely physical. There were no monitors or keyboards on the desks of these corporate users. Data was still entirely managed through paper tape, long ribbons of paper where mechanical punches stamped holes representing binary code. A room of young women, often recruited directly from secretarial pools, would sit at teleprinters, manually typing out financial records, insurance policies, and engineering measurements. Every keystroke punched a corresponding hole into the tape. This fragile paper ribbon was then carefully carried to the Pegasus and fed into an optical reader. The machine would pull the tape through at high speed, shining a light through the holes to read the data. Inside the cabinet, that data was sent to the machine's magnetic drum memory, a spinning metal cylinder coated in magnetic material that stored data and instructions, acting as an early, fast version of a hard drive. The drum spun constantly, emitting a distinct, high-pitched hum that became the defining sound of a 1950s data processing room. Because the machine was reliable, software could finally become standardized. Ferranti did not just ship a physical computer, they shipped a comprehensive library of subroutines. If an insurance company needed to calculate square roots or complex financial algorithms, their programmers did not have to write the code from scratch. They simply copied the standard Ferranti routine from the master library. This was the quiet birth of the British software ecosystem. The hardware was the product, but the library of shared code was what made the machine indispensable. The Pegasus was an overwhelming triumph. Ferranti manufactured and sold 38 of these machines. In the context of modern consumer electronics, 38 units is a rounding error. In the late 1950s, it made the Pegasus the most popular computer in Britain and one of the most widely adopted architectures in Europe. It proved that a British technology company did not just have to build experimental prototypes. They could build a reliable, standardized product that the corporate world was willing to trust with its most critical data. Ferranti had captured the universities, the military, and the commercial office. They had built an ecosystem of engineers, programmers, and business buyers who looked to a factory in Greater Manchester for the future of processing. Ferranti had proven that computers belonged in British business. Now they wanted to prove they could build the most powerful machine on Earth. The success of the Pegasus had given Ferranti control of the British commercial computing market. They had proved they could build a reliable machine that a mid-sized engineering firm or a high-street bank could trust. But a nation's technological standing is not built purely on payroll processing. To truly dominate the global computing landscape, Ferranti needed to push the physical limits of electronics. In 1956, while Pegasus machines were being installed in London offices, a team of engineers at Ferranti's West Gorton factory in Manchester began a new collaboration with the University of Manchester. The goal was to build a computer that was not just faster than anything in Britain, but faster than anything on Earth. The project was initially called Muse, short for Microsecond Engine, before being renamed the Ferranti Atlas. When the first Atlas was officially commissioned at the University of Manchester in December 1962, it was a staggering achievement of British engineering. At the time it was switched on, it was widely considered to be the most powerful supercomputer in the world. The jump in processing speed was so immense that it was famously said that whenever the Atlas was turned off for maintenance, Britain temporarily lost half of its total national computing capacity. In a post-war Britain still rebuilding its industry, the Atlas was not merely a machine. It was a physical declaration that the country which had cracked the Enigma code could still dictate the architecture of the future. To achieve this unprecedented speed, Ferranti and the university team had to invent entirely new concepts in computer science, concepts that still govern how modern digital devices operate today. The most significant of these was virtual memory, a system that allows a computer to seamlessly use slower, cheaper storage as if it were fast, expensive main memory. Before the Atlas, a programmer had to manually calculate how to move data back and forth between a computer's fast core memory and its slower magnetic storage drums. If a program was too large to fit into the fast memory, it simply would not run without the programmer painstakingly writing complex workarounds. The Atlas automated this entirely. Its operating system, the core software that manages the computer and lets other programs run, known as the Atlas supervisor, monitored the machine's memory in real time. It secretly moved blocks of data, called pages, between the magnetic drum and the fast memory without the programmer ever needing to know. To the person writing the code, the computer simply appeared to have an endless, unbroken expanse of fast memory. Decades later, this exact principle of virtual memory would be built into every personal computer, tablet, and smartphone operating system on the planet. The Atlas also perfected multiprogramming, the ability for a computer to run several different programs at what appears to be the same time. Because the Atlas processor was so intensely fast, it spent a frustrating amount of time waiting for mechanical peripherals, like paper tape readers or card punches, to catch up. The Atlas supervisor solved this by constantly shifting its attention. If one program paused to wait for a paper tape to load, the processor instantly switched to calculating another university department's physics problem before switching back milliseconds later. This was no longer a single machine calculating one sum at a time. It was a central processing utility. The scale of the Atlas was vast. A full installation consumed massive amounts of electricity and required a purpose-built suite of rooms. It was so expensive, costing roughly 2 to 3 million pounds, an unthinkable sum in 1962, that only 3 complete Atlas I systems were ever built. One went to the University of Manchester, one to the University of London, and one to the Rutherford High Energy Laboratory at Chiltern, where it became the central computing hub for British atomic and scientific research. The Atlas at Chiltern did not just serve one laboratory. Researchers from Cambridge University and the Ministry of Aviation did not always have to travel to the machine. They could send their data over early post office telecommunications lines. It was a faint early blueprint of a cloud service, a system where remote users borrowed time on a distant, massively powerful server. The physical environment of an Atlas installation was the peak of early 1960s British technological optimism. The machine room was a pristine landscape of imposing metal cabinets, spinning magnetic tape drives, and blinking control consoles. The floor was raised to hide the miles of thick cabling required to connect the logic bays to the memory units. A dedicated team of operators worked around the clock, feeding towering stacks of punch cards and miles of paper tape into the system, managing a constant flow of jobs from scientists, engineers, and government departments. For a brief window in the early 1960s, Ferranti stood at the absolute summit of the global industry. They had the Pegasus securing the commercial offices, they had military computers guiding naval defense systems, and they had the Atlas, defining the very boundaries of what a digital machine could achieve. While the Atlas dominated the academic and scientific elite, Ferranti was also cementing its control over the physical landscape of Britain. The company had created a separate lineage of machines designed not for the pristine, air-conditioned environment of a university laboratory, but for the brutal, unforgiving world of heavy industry and defense. This was the domain of the Ferranti Argus. Introduced in the late 1950s and refined throughout the 60s, the Argus was an industrial process control computer, a machine built to directly monitor and manage physical equipment in real time without needing a human operator to punch in instructions on paper tape. It was robust, compact, and designed to run continuously for years in environments where dust, heat, and intense vibration would have destroyed an ordinary business computer. The Argus embedded Ferranti into the very infrastructure of the nation. When Imperial Chemical Industries needed to automate a sprawling chemical plant in Fleetwood, Lancashire, they installed a Ferranti Argus to control the hazardous mixture of gases. When the Central Electricity Generating Board built the Wilfa nuclear power station in Wales, they relied on Argus computers to monitor thousands of critical temperature and pressure sensors across the reactors. Even the defense of the realm was reliant on Ferranti logic. The company's factories in Edinburgh designed the guidance computers for the Bloodhound surface-to-air missile system, guarding Royal Air Force bases from the threat of Cold War bombers. If a British citizen turned on a light switch, boarded a commercial jet, or relied on the military radar grid in the early 1960s, they were interacting with a physical system orchestrated by a Ferranti processor. The reach of this technology extended to the cosmos. At the Jodrell Bank Observatory in Cheshire, a Ferranti Argus was installed to control the colossal Lovell telescope. The computer calculated the complex orbital mathematics required to keep the massive 250-foot steel dish locked onto distant stars and passing satellites, adjusting its massive gears in real time. At this moment, Ferranti was not merely participating in the computer industry, they were defining it. They had built a vertically integrated empire that stretched from the microscopic to the monumental. They manufactured their own silicon transistors, they designed their own logic circuits, they built their own tape readers, and they assembled the giant metal cabinets on their own factory floors in Greater Manchester, Oldham, and Scotland. The ecosystem was entirely self-sufficient. A British programmer could write code on a British machine, running a British operating system to control a British nuclear reactor. This was the absolute peak of the company's computing glory. Ferranti employed thousands of skilled workers across the country, running dedicated research laboratories that operated on a scale unmatched by any other European technology firm. The name Ferranti carried an almost gravitational weight in government and industrial circles. If a complex problem required the absolute bleeding edge of digital calculation, the automatic assumption was that the engineers at Hollandwood or West Gorton would supply the answer. But beneath this sprawling industrial triumph, a structural vulnerability was quietly forming. Ferranti was, at its heart, an engineering dynasty. It was run by engineers for engineers. When faced with a new technological challenge, their instinct was always to invent a completely new bespoke architecture to solve it perfectly. They built the Pegasus specifically for business calculations. They built the Argus for industrial control. They built the Atlas for sheer scientific speed. Each machine was a masterpiece of specialized hardware, but they shared very little common architecture. Code written for the Pegasus could not run on the Atlas. A peripheral device built for the Argus could not simply be plugged into a commercial mainframe. Every time a customer bought a different Ferranti machine, the programmers had to learn an entirely new system. This relentless pursuit of bespoke engineering perfection was catastrophically expensive. Building the fastest supercomputer on Earth required immense capital, and the market for a massive £2 million machine like the Atlas was inherently limited to a handful of wealthy governments and universities. Ferranti was funding its computer division like a national research institute, but it was operating in a commercial market that was about to change the rules of survival. The Atlas was a masterpiece of British engineering, but engineering alone could no longer protect Ferranti from the American sales machine waiting across the Atlantic. The first crack in Ferranti's empire was almost invisible. In 1962, while the Atlas supercomputer was drawing awe from the global scientific community, the atmosphere inside Ferranti's commercial computing division in Manchester was quietly unraveling. The problem was not a lack of ambition. The problem was a new machine called the Orion. Ferranti had designed the Orion to be their next-generation commercial mainframe, a large, powerful computer intended to sit at the heart of major British corporations and government departments, replacing the aging Pegasus. On paper, it was a brilliant piece of hardware, but hardware was no longer the only thing that mattered. By the early 1960s, a computer was useless without a highly complex operating system and a vast library of reliable software. Ferranti was fundamentally a heavy engineering firm. Their culture was built on soldering wires, casting metal, and designing logic circuits. They severely underestimated the sheer human cost and immense difficulty of writing complex, stable software for a commercial audience. The Orion project began to suffer catastrophic delays. The software was bug-ridden, and the hardware costs were spiraling out of control. When the first Orion machines were finally delivered to frustrated British customers, the company was losing massive amounts of money on every unit sold. At this exact moment, the market shifted from a battle of invention to a battle of scale. And that scale was American. Across the Atlantic, IBM was not just building computers. They were building an inescapable corporate ecosystem. When a British business looked at an IBM machine, they were not just buying a processor. They were buying into a massive, heavily funded support network. IBM provided a vast catalog of ready-made software, a leasing model that removed the risk of owning expensive hardware, and an army of salesmen in sharp suits who promised absolute reliability. IBM did not wait for customers to come to them. They actively flooded the commercial market. While Ferranti was painstakingly hand-building a few dozen machines a year in Greater Manchester, IBM was mass-producing thousands of units of the IBM 1401, completely standardizing the way a modern office processed its data. The leadership at Ferranti looked at the American financial capital pouring into the computing market and realized a devastating truth. They could not afford to compete. To stay in the commercial mainframe business meant outspending IBM on software development, marketing, and global retail logistics. A war that a British electrical engineering firm simply did not have the treasury to fight. In September 1963, Ferranti made a permanent, irreversible decision. They surrendered the corporate office. The company agreed to sell its entire commercial computing division to International Computers and Tabulators, or ICT, a rival British firm that would later become ICL. For £8.4 million, Ferranti handed over their factories at West Gorton, their commercial software teams, and their designs for the Orion and the Atlas. Overnight, 1,900 Ferranti employees were transferred to a new employer. This was not a complete bankruptcy, but it was a profound cultural amputation. The nation that had built the world's first commercial computer in 1951 had, just 12 years later, seen its pioneering company retreat from the very market it had created. The Ferranti logo was quietly removed from the high street, the payroll departments, and the university computing centers. But Ferranti did not die in 1963. They simply retreated to the shadows. Having shed the crushing financial weight of commercial software and mainframe marketing, the company refocused entirely on what they knew best: military electronics, avionics, and the Argus industrial computers. They built radar systems for the Royal Air Force. They designed laser targeting pods for fighter jets. They supplied complex command systems for Royal Navy frigates. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, Ferranti thrived as a defense contractor. Their factories in Edinburgh and Cheadle Heath expanded, entirely shielded from the brutal, rapidly changing world of home computers, microprocessors, and Microsoft software that was reshaping the civilian world. They were highly profitable, deeply embedded in the Ministry of Defense, and completely disconnected from the public high street. The company had successfully escaped the commercial war against IBM, but by retreating behind the closed doors of the defense industry, they had tied their survival to a market dictated by government budgets and exposed themselves to a fatal temptation waiting at the end of the 1980s. By the late 1980s, the global geopolitical landscape was shifting. The Cold War was drawing to a close, and the British Ministry of Defense began to radically reduce its military spending. The guaranteed government contracts that had sheltered Ferranti from the commercial computing bloodbath 2 decades earlier were rapidly drying up. Ferranti, now deeply reliant on defense electronics to fund its sprawling research divisions, realized that to survive in this contracting market, it had to expand its scale once again. It had to break into the incredibly lucrative, heavily protected United States defense market. To achieve this scale, Ferranti needed an American partner. In 1987, they agreed to a massive merger with International Signal and Control, or ISC, a defense and communications contractor based in Pennsylvania. On paper, it seemed like a masterstroke of corporate strategy. ISC claimed to hold highly classified, enormously profitable missile and weapons contracts, largely with foreign governments in the Middle East. By acquiring ISC, Ferranti transformed into Ferranti International Signal, instantly becoming one of the most powerful and heavily capitalized defense electronics firms on the planet. But the culture of the two companies could not have been more different. Ferranti was a traditional, 111-year-old British engineering dynasty built on rigorous physical testing, factory production, and slow, methodical innovation. ISC was aggressive, opaque, and seemingly capable of generating staggering profits from secretive international deals. For 2 years, the British giant believed it had finally solved its scale problem. It had the engineering brilliance of Manchester and Scotland, backed by the global sales machine of Pennsylvania. But the foundation of that future was completely hollow. In 1989, the illusion violently shattered. Following an internal audit and an investigation into the company's increasingly complex accounts, Ferranti uncovered a devastating truth. The massive, secretive defense contracts that ISC had claimed to hold did not exist. They were phantom projects, elaborate fictions, supported by forged documents and fake front companies, created entirely to inflate the American company's value before the merger. International Signal and Control was not a highly profitable partner. It was a sprawling, sophisticated financial fraud engineered by its founder, James Guerin, who would later be sentenced to 15 years in an American federal prison. For Ferranti, the financial hole was catastrophic. The company was suddenly carrying 215 million pounds of non-existent assets on its balance sheet. The fraud completely destroyed the company's valuation. Its share price collapsed. Overnight, the British engineering dynasty went from a global technological powerhouse to a corporation fighting for its very survival in the London bankruptcy courts. While the boardroom in London was collapsing under the weight of financial fraud, the physical machines Ferranti had built continued to operate seamlessly across the British landscape. Inside nuclear power stations, the Argus computers did not stop monitoring reactor temperatures. At the Jodrell Bank Observatory, the Ferranti processors kept the massive radio telescope perfectly aligned with the stars. The technology had never failed. The problem was not the silicon, the software, or the engineering. The problem was the corporate ecosystem required to sustain it. To stay alive, Ferranti had to begin a desperate, brutal process of selling off its own limbs. The highly skilled engineering ecosystem that had taken decades to build in Britain was dismantled in months. In 1990, Ferranti was forced to sell Ferranti Defense Systems, the absolute crown jewel of their radar and avionics operations, employing thousands of people in Edinburgh, to their bitter British rival, GEC Marconi. They sold off their semiconductor business to Plessey. They sold their computer systems division, the descendant of the Argus lineage, to the French company Thomson CSF. The vertically integrated empire that had once built its own transistors, its own memory drums, and its own supercomputers was ruthlessly carved up and auctioned off simply to pay off debts from a fraud they did not commit. The thousands of British engineers who had spent their careers designing the architecture of the future found themselves absorbed into foreign conglomerates or suddenly redundant. The local economies in Greater Manchester and Scotland, which had relied on Ferranti factories for generations, lost a major industrial anchor. But the sales could only delay the inevitable. Stripped of its most profitable divisions, suffocated by debt, and with its reputation fatally damaged, the hollowed-out shell of Ferranti could not continue. In December 1993, the money finally ran out. Ferranti International went into administrative receivership. The decline was absolute. The money vanished, the research teams scattered, the factories went dark, the assets were absorbed, the pioneer was gone. In just over 40 years, the company that had delivered the world's first commercially available general-purpose computer had been completely erased from the corporate landscape. The logo was gone, the factories were sold, and the pioneer was dead. But the architecture they had built refused to disappear. When a technology empire collapses, it does not disappear instantly. It shatters into pieces, absorbed by rivals and forgotten by the market, until only the physical artifacts remain. The corporate entity of Ferranti was completely dismantled in the early 1990s. The factories at Hollinwood, where generations of electrical engineers had built the foundations of the national grid and the early computer age, were eventually demolished. The West Gorton facility, where the Atlas was conceived, passed through the hands of ICT, then ICL, and ultimately Fujitsu, marking the final transition of British computing hardware into foreign ownership. The sprawling defense divisions in Edinburgh were swallowed by GEC Marconi and later BAE Systems. The Ferranti name, once synonymous with absolute British technological supremacy, was wiped from the industrial map. Today, to find a physical Ferranti computer, one must look away from the high street in the corporate office and step into the quiet archives of British museums. At the Science Museum in London, a Ferranti Pegasus stands preserved. At the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester and the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, the remnants of the Mark I and the broader British mainframe era are carefully maintained behind glass. But these machines are not kept merely for nostalgia. Looking at a Ferranti computer today is not a romantic look back at a slower, simpler era of thermionic valves and paper tape. It is an act of examining the precise moment when the modern world was designed. The legacy of Ferranti is not defined by the machines they failed to sell in the 1990s. It is defined by the architecture they permanently embedded into global computing. This brings us to a profound, often overlooked footnote in digital history. If you are watching this documentary on a modern smartphone, a tablet, or a desktop computer, you are actively relying on a concept invented by Ferranti in the University of Manchester in 1962. When you open a heavy application or switch between dozens of web browser tabs, your device does not crash. It secretly and seamlessly moves blocks of data between its fast memory and its internal storage, tricking the software into believing it has infinite space to operate. That system is virtual memory. It was first commercialized and proven on the Ferranti Atlas. The British engineers who built that massive, room-sized supercomputer solved a fundamental bottleneck of digital processing. IBM, Microsoft, Apple, and Google did not invent this concept. They inherited it from a British engineering firm in Greater Manchester. The architecture survived, the company did not. The tragedy of Ferranti is the ultimate blueprint for the broader collapse of the British technology sector. For decades, Britain operated under the assumption that if it produced the most brilliant engineers, and if those engineers built the most advanced, mathematically perfect machines, the market would naturally follow. Ferranti proved that Britain never lacked the capacity to invent. The Mark I proved they could manufacture the future. The Pegasus proved they could make it reliable. The Atlas proved they could make it the fastest on Earth. What Ferranti lacked, and what the British digital economy repeatedly failed to build throughout the latter half of the 20th century, was the ruthless, heavily capitalized commercial ecosystem required to protect those inventions. Ferranti approached computing as an engineering challenge to be solved with bespoke, brilliant hardware. Across the Atlantic, American corporations approached computing as a retail and logistical war, fought with standardization, massive software libraries, and global marketing budgets. The British built perfect prototypes. The Americans built inescapable platforms. When the market demanded the standardization and scale, the British pioneer simply could not afford to compete. The nation that had delivered the first commercial computer in 1951, beating the United States to the starting line, was ultimately forced to buy the digital future back from American vendors. The invention was British. The market it created became fundamentally global. But history is not only recorded in corporate balance sheets or the names of the companies that survived. It is recorded in the physical objects that first taught a country how to process its data. Somewhere in a London museum, perfectly preserved behind a pane of temperature-controlled glass, sits a single plastic and metal plug-in package from a Ferranti Pegasus. Its valves are cold, its wiring is silent, but it remains a physical testament to a brief, brilliant window in time, when a factory in Greater Manchester did not just participate in the computer industry, but held the absolute architecture of the future in its hands. See you in the next one.